All right. Well, jumping on here on a Saturday afternoon to talk some more about the issues with the debate. There's a lot of good material coming out of the debate that I had with Dr. White, even some of these reviews and some of the discussions that follow. I'm seeing a lot of good information. I'm seeing a lot of good talks. I'm seeing a lot of positive reviews. But I want to address, once again, the proper methodology of how you do an exegetical debate. Now, we're going to talk about this here in a second. But I'm going to play a clip of some of the post-debate discussion that Dr. White had with Jeremiah Nortier. Now, we played some of this the other day in like an 18-minute video. But I'm going to play some portions that we did not cover and talk about this. And as he's talking about it, we're going to discuss the proper way to do an exegetical debate and what an exegetical debate it even is. If you don't know these things, we'll talk about them. Now, so just remind you that I'm trying to do my live podcast Mondays. I think I made it on Tuesday last time, but Monday, Tuesday, when I can, when I don't work late. And then the podcast is available afterwards on podcast platforms, so this is not the podcast. This is just a jumping on the YouTube on Saturday kind of thing, but we'll see. All right, Theology Matters, Lindsay, Chris, Dyson, good to see you guys. Thanks for being a part of it. Well, I've been really excited and encouraged by the responses. We've talked about this, a lot of good reviews, even from Calvinists. Now, one thing I saw more than anything, I suppose, from Calvinists is how much they appreciated the interaction, how much they appreciated the back and forth, and it wasn't mean-spirited. Now, it really wasn't, and Dr. White has had some things to say about that. Well, one of the things is he says he wished that he would not have been as nice. Well, what does that mean? Well, as we look at the clips of what he's going to say here, I'll give you my opinion on really what's behind all that. Now, and again, this is going to be about, at least in part, properly exegeting a passage in a debate context. And what that is about. Because I don't think Dr. White is understanding it. And White, of all people, should know. And this isn't just going to be a rehash about him, being inconsistent with Professor Leighton Flowers because he's doing the same thing. Really, I want to make sure people understand, especially some of my Calvinist friends out there. But Dr. White himself, if he ever pays attention to this, is missing the point with these things. And so, how you properly exegete, because remember that an exegetical debate, like here's a passage you debate, is different from a debate on a topic. And they have their pros and cons, and they're not the same for each. But and in general, also, this is about responding to some of the things that Dr. White has said. In the portions of that discussion he had with Nortier, that we didn't get to. Yes, someone's saying I had several compliments. Well, I'll tell you why I think that is. Because I try to demonstrate myself to be very fair and honest, and I'm not. And let's face it, there are gotcha questions in a debate. A debate is about one side trying to demonstrate the error of the other. You're not debating if you don't think that there's error. I don't like debates when one side is really trying to figure out what's happening with the theology on the other side. Like in the cross-examination, I see debates where one guy, maybe it's someone I agree with, he keeps questioning the other person because he's trying to figure out what he believes. You should not be debating if you don't know what the other person believes. Now, are there some caveats to this? Yes, there's some qualifications. Number one, you're never going to be omniscient about everything a person believes. I've listened to Dr. White for years. There's going to be some things that I don't understand, that I may have to ask qualifying questions in a debate. So that is going to happen. Sometimes you just don't have a lot of material on your opponent. He's not someone that has material out there and you don't know. Well, so some of it might be you trying to figure out, but you should know pretty much what position he says, what position he holds. And so I don't like a debate where one side is trying to figure out the other side. It doesn't do good, because you need to be two guys presenting your material and you know the errors of the other. So there's going to be gotchas, but I'm not trying to do a gotcha in the sense of just live the whole debate on that one moment of how well I did. But obviously I am wanting to get as much mileage I can out of particular answers that I believe demonstrate big problems with the other side. I think that happened with Dr. White. I think the irrationality of the patience, God having patience with his own decree, and the Calvinistic perspective, I think, did not serve him well. And I've always said that Calvinism is irrational. And I think the biggest victory was him conceding that God can be sovereign and is sovereign even if man has libertarian free will. And by the way, libertarian free will is really just free will. See, I don't believe compatibilistic free will, as the Calvinists would affirm it. Compatibilistic Calvinist. They'll say, yeah, we believe God is free. No, I don't believe that's really free. But I digress for the moment. But having him concede that is very important, and a lot of people are talking about that. And Dr. White himself says, he's getting a lot of pushback. You'll hear something about that in the clip that we're going to play. I got 2 clips. And so this is the point of a debate. It really is. People ask, do you really think that you're going to change the mind of the person you're debating? No, I don't. A debate is not about changing the mind. It's not even about necessarily reaching the opponent that you're debating, although that would be ideal, but it's very unlikely. It's about presenting to the audience things that they might not have understood if all they know is the other side. There is biblical precedent behind these principles that I'm talking about. In Proverbs, it says, I'll paraphrase it here, a man may seem right, his argument may seem good until his neighbor comes and examines him. In other words, someone says something and people will think, that's really sounds good. But then someone comes and examines him and analyzes it and shows it's not so good. And people think, oh, okay, well, yeah. So that's really, to me, what a debate is supposed to be about. And so I think the big compliment a lot of Calvinists are giving the debate is they like the interaction. So I think, one, because neither one of us were jerks. But the other thing is because, well, see, how do I word this? I have to be careful how I word this, because it may come off as something I don't mean it to. But in fact, I'm afraid to say it, to be honest with you. Well, let me just say it like this. Dr. White is highly intelligent, and he can be very intellectual. I'm not afraid that I can't keep up on the same level when it comes to these theological issues. I can be right there. I've thought through these things for a long time. I've studied Calvinists because I want to know who and what they believe, because I want to steel man Calvinist. And so I could be right there on top of it and keeping up with it. And I think people saying, well, this is a meat versus meat. This is iron and iron. And this idea about him saying, well, I should have been meaner. Well, again, I think this will come up here when we talk about it. But Tax Savage, we haven't seen him in a while here. I couldn't believe it when he affirmed about Adam having libertarian free will and God still able to be sovereign. Well, yeah, see, people are talking about it, and that is a huge victory. And I've got a couple of, well, we're going to talk about it. I got some issues on that. So, but yeah, it's great. So, exegeting Calvinism, Dr. White is committed to a system, not to the truth of Scripture. I got to give credit where credit is due. I posted a meme, and I got it from Exegeting Calvinism, and I don't know really anything about him, but I get lots of comments and lots of posts from people saying, check this out, I did this. But I saw that meme, and I don't think the meme is mean-spirited. I don't like mean-spirited memes. I don't like mean-spirited. you know, thumbnails or stuff like that. I don't like thumbnails where you're putting your opponent in these weird positions with their facial expressions, at least purposely. And so I don't like that. But I thought that was a good meme, and I thought it was comical enough because it's based upon the truth that Dr. White was trying to do more on Romans 8. Even in these clips, he's doing more on Romans 8 than he is in Romans 9. And go to my Facebook, or I think I even posted it on YouTube, if I'm not mistaken, this meme where you got, you know, for those who haven't seen it, and I didn't think to pull it up, but it's where there's a guy walking with his girlfriend or wife or something in the distance, and a girl walking closer to the camera, towards the camera. The guy's turning around and looking at her, and his wife is staring at him like, what are you looking at? Well, so it says James White on the man. On his wife or girlfriend, it says debate on Romans 9, and the girl he's staring at is Romans 8. I thought it hit the nail on the head in a very comical way, and I think that's the issue is and so this addresses, or this concerns, what I want to talk about is what is the proper way to do a kind of debate on a passage like we were doing? Well, we'll talk about it, but I'm going to pull these clips up. So let's see here. Which one? Let's see. Do this one first. And if we have time, if I don't have to jump off here by then, we'll even look more at the audience Q&A from the actual debate. So here we go. If you can't hear the audio or something, let me know. Again, this is from the Apologetic Dog channel, and this is the same discussion we talked about the other day, but this is a portion we didn't get to.
And get to know a little bit about the church. So yeah, that's what led to the debate, where, again, like the preceding debate, I had a pretty good feeling where things were going to go, because he had done 2 debates before on Romans 9, one with Matt Slick and one with Turretin Fan.
Right.
And I wanted ours to be more similar to the Turretin Fan one than the Matt Slick one, because while the opening statements in both of them were very useful, it got rather heated and nasty pretty quick in the Matt Slick debate.
Now, just on that point, I tell you my theory, and I have said this, I think I said this with Leighton Flowers, but so he said it in this discussion more than once, that he should have been not as nice to me. Well, I mean, that's fine with me. I mean, I've seen Dr. White be pretty upset in debates, and let's understand what we're talking about. And what exactly he means by not nice, well, only he can say. But if you mean more aggressive, I think there's a difference between being aggressive and being mean. And maybe I somewhat blurred the lines in my Romans 9 debate, and there's kind of a background there. But he's mentioned even before the debate, he mentioned the Romans 9 debate I had with Slick several times, even I think in present, before we started going live and all that. Now, his reason for saying he should have gone meaner, he says it doesn't really make sense, because I was talking with Warren McGrew, and I guess I just shouldn't have been doing that, in his opinion. And if I'm going to associate with Warren McGrew, or at least have a discussion with Warren McGrew, then he just should have not been as nice. Well, I'm not sure that's the meaning. Only God knows, and Dr. White, his true meaning. I'm not trying to get inside of his head, but I'll just tell you my opinion. Based upon him mentioning so many times ahead of time, and even now, the Matt Slick Romans 9 debate, I was very aggressive in the Romans 9 debate. And I want to remind you guys that you can be aggressive and not take it personally. And even though Matt Slick, I think, did here and there, he was highly offended that I told him that he doesn't know his own theology. And, but, Matt Slick came on my channel sometime after that, and we discussed total depravity, and it was very cordial. The whole discussion, it's still there. I mean, it was very nice. He complimented me even in the end. I think what happened is Dr. White saw that I can I can be friendly with, and kind of somewhat calm and kind of laid back as I was with Turretin Fan. But he saw also that if pushed, I will push back like I did with Matt Slick. And I think he could see that I wasn't, I'm not the smartest guy in the world, right? But I'm not stupid when it comes to these matters. He may think I'm wrong, but he knows I can keep up with him. He was even talking about how I listened to him pre-debate, and Dr. White was talking about how, well, I can, AK has the ability to talk without looking at notes, and he could kind of talk freely. And so I think he knew it would be an engaging debate. He said as much. This is going to be an engaging debate. So he knew, well, if I push him, he's going to push me, and he saw how I can push. And I think what the real reason he stayed nice is because, for one, he doesn't know me fully because, I don't think he studied me. I got all kinds of videos and material. I think he's only really watched 2. And so he doesn't know exactly where I'll go on things. And so you have to kind of play that by ear. But at the same time, he knows that I'll push right back. And I think that's the real reason he was nice. And he's very nice. And I don't have a problem with that. Now, with Matt Slick, by the way, I debated him, and everybody said, one time, and everybody said, no, you were too nice. And that was my first debate online, formal debate. And I've had only one in person before that. And I said, well, okay. And so I figured out the proper policy is rise to the energy level of your opponent, but don't be a jerk, and you obviously don't want to be mean, but you can get to the energy and you can push. So that's what I did with Slick, because everybody knows that Slick is pushy, and I was going to show Slick, you're not going to be a pushover on me, and I'm going to, that's the way it was. Now, I haven't seen that debate in forever since I did it, and so I don't know, was I mean? I don't think I was mean. I think I was pushy. But I think I've even sharpened my skills in that level since then. And so with Turretin Fan, you don't want to get too aggressive with Turretin Fan. It's going to make you look mean just because he's so calm and collected. He's so soft-spoken. He's so gentle. Now, with Dr. White, I knew I could do whatever. If he's going to be calm, really respectful and jokey, I'll do the same. And if he rises, I'll rise. And I think he knew that. I think that's why he stayed so nice. And I think that's the real reason he was like that. Now, because the other reason he's given, just because I was having a conversation with somebody he doesn't like, that doesn't make sense to me. Yeah. Well, someone says Slick was arrogant and condescending. Well, yeah, I think that's the difference. At least I make the attempt. I'm trying to be pushy in the debate if I have to be, and just as energetic, but without being arrogant and condescending. Of course, maybe I'm not always successful. I could draw it back. Maybe, I'm not perfect in these maneuvers, but I think since then I'm homing these things in, Now, this was only my third in-person live debate. I'm very comfortable with debates, and it's much different than online debates. I much rather do that, and that's probably the route I'll go mostly from here on out. But and I could already just from my now the first one was not broadcast or anything, and so I already knew walking away from the debate. I was like, even now I got a much better grasp on this presentation and interaction with an audience in a debate, because it's very much my comfort level, just debating and interacting and looking at people's arguments. But anyway, let's just keep on going with the video.
And that really, from my perspective, detracts a lot from the final usefulness of the debate. And so, and I had felt like not only was Turretin Fan's presentation of Romans 9 very much my own, but at the same time, the questions that Turretin Fan asked of him, I thought really got to the key issues. And so it had been very useful. And of course, he'd know my view of Romans 9. He'd have my published books. He'd have, the Leighton Flowers debate, where, hey, at least one thing that has to be said straight up front is at least we got much more into the actual text of Romans 9 in this debate than we ever did in the Leighton Flowers debate, because again, Flowers had not only his opening.
He never misses an opportunity to criticize Leighton Flowers. I'm here to tell you, by the way, whatever you think of one's approach to a debate, and Leighton Flowers, if you watch that Romans 9 debate, he was no nicer, or I was no nicer than him. I mean, I have found Leighton Flowers to be a very nice and polite guy. I remember he was very polite and nice in that debate. But even in that debate, he was more aggressive towards Flowers. Now, maybe that's because Flowers probably was, I don't know. I really don't know. But my guess is maybe Flowers is already well known, already established an influence. I don't really know, but it's probably why amongst Baptists, because Dr. White is also a Baptist. And then, of course, in that second debate on John 6, man, he just despises Leighton Flowers there. But he never misses an opportunity. But what he's saying here, and this is the issue, what he's saying is we stayed in the text much more, talking about he and I. Well, that's thanks to me. Anybody can see it too. Anybody can see it. Even Calvinists conceded, of course. If you read, I've saw many comments from Calvinists admitting such. And that was the funny remark. That's why the meme was just funny to me. Thanks to me, we stayed in it. Now, we would have spent most of our time in Romans 8, and he in fact did, but we would have spent most of our time in Romans 8, and then about once saved, always saved, he wanted to talk about baptism, all the while talking about how I brought up baptism when he did it, this kind of thing that we've talked about. So thanks to me, Dr. White, we spent much more time in the debate. And so that's the way it should be. So he's saying that, but he was not doing it. And by the way, I do have the fan on here. I think you can occasionally hear it blowing into the mic. It's hot in here. But if it's ever a bother, if you think I hear too much blowing in the mic, it'd be my fan. I can turn it off. And so I want to talk about this for a second, and we're going to listen to more. There could be a moment at some point here. I don't anticipate it soon, but it could be where I have to jump off to go do something, but I think it won't be here. Thanks for that, exegeting Calvinism. So, what is the proper method of a debate? How do you do it on a passage? Because the number one criticism, I told you the compliment, but the number one criticism that Calvinists are saying is, no, it's fine for him to go to Romans 8. Well, this is the issue. As soon as Dr. White started in his opening, he was mentioning this is about presuppositions. This is about the fall of man, the nature of man. Of course, he's talking about the T of tulip. He mentions Romans 5 and Romans 8 and spiritual versus the carnally minded man and that kind of thing. And then, of course, Romans 8, where it talks about predestination, as they say, the golden chain of redemption. Well, and so the number one complaint is that Calvinists take an issue that he spent so much time in Romans 8. They're saying it's the immediate context. I'm here to tell you, it may be relevant, and it is, but you're not understanding, and neither evidently does Dr. White, how this is supposed to work. Okay, so maybe we could give an example here, maybe randomly here. Let's see. How about this? Could be. Trying to think of an example here. I'm trying to think of a neutral passage. Well, we could do the Romans 8 thing. Now, I did passages with David Lewis. Actually, okay, bear with me one moment while I do something. But it's about how you approach a passage that where your opponent uses it as a proof passage, but you don't, versus a passage where both of you are arguing for this passage as a proof text for your opposing theologies. Because everybody, you could probably, I think that's the issue, and I think people should be able to understand that. Well, if not, actually, I just thought of something. I was in Deuteronomy, but actually, since we're in Deuteronomy, that's one example. I can go to Deuteronomy 6. Okay, so everybody think about this. You're debating a passage. If one person of the two uses the passage or believes or has argued or is arguing that that passage is a proof text or establishes or proves something in their beliefs that their opponent denies, but doesn't see the same passage as proof of his opposing theology, then that's going to be different than if you're debating a passage where both opponents believe that their opposing theologies is a proof text for their theology. Then it's going to be handled differently. Why is that? Because both of you are arguing that the passage proves something about your beliefs that the other person denies. Okay, the former option is where Dr. White and I, for the most part, are on Romans 9. I do not claim so much, at least I'm not using it as such in Romans 9, that it is a proof text for my theology. Now, it's not that I don't think that it can be, it's just that at least the portions, most of it, is not about the issues of my theology where I disagree and challenge Calvinists on. See, I don't think Paul is trying to establish things about libertarian free will in the passage. He's not having the discussions that Calvinists and non-Calvinists have on our disagreements. Now, I think there's certain implications from it, especially near the end of the chapter, where it certainly favors my theology, where it would be opposed to Calvinist theology. But really, my presentation and the way I exegeted at least the first 24 verses, or as much as I could in the time, which was most of those verses in that section. And by the way, that's the most debated part of the chapter. My exegesis, or rather my objective, was to exegete and demonstrate that a proper exegesis, while it doesn't necessarily disprove Calvinism, it cannot establish it. You understand the difference? And if you don't, let's talk about in kind of this example. Well, you have the Shema here. So you know the Shema is famous passage, maybe the most for Jews, but Deuteronomy 6:4 says, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh our God, Yahweh is one." Now, so if we were having a Trinitarian debate, you know, Trinity versus Unitarians, and we were doing an exegetical debate on this passage. Now, this is a very short verse, so it's almost unhelpful probably to do such a limited scope. You know, at least a chapter or a bigger section. You know, Romans 9 is a pretty big chapter. You know, if you get down to one verse and stuff like that, it's almost where, you know, this is just not going to be an effective debate. You're too limited. But but this is just an example that I'm thinking of here. So I would not do like one verse debate for the most part. You need a little bit more than that, right? But anyway, let's say that we did, and I was debating a Unitarian, and he was using this passage to demonstrate that the Trinity is false, that there is only one person, and that God is one person. So Jesus can't be God, the Spirit can't be God, and this kind of thing, because then there would be, you know how they argue, right? And I'm not trying to get into that issue per se. I'm just giving you an example of something here. They would argue, well, that would be three gods, that kind of thing. He's saying, you see, Yahweh is one, not three. So what I would do is I would I would try to exegete the debate or the verse and try to demonstrate that no, you're making certain assumptions. You're bringing in certain ideas that could not be established here and that this is not talking about. I would say we all believe there's one God, so this is not a contradiction to our belief. We believe there's one God. Now, New Testament revelation demonstrates not multiple gods or more than one God, but distinctions in persons, and you could get into all that, of course. But you see, what I would be doing is showing properly exegeted, the Shema, that's what it's called here, does not disprove the Trinity, although it doesn't establish it. So I would just be exegeting, here's what it says. I would be exegeting the verse and showing, well, here's all it says. It just say God is one. We believe that. That doesn't say anything about whether there are three persons, that kind of thing. And so what would this be? And I would be emphasizing, well, no, you're saying more than the verse is saying. It's not talking about persons. It's not talking about the same thing as what you see in the New Testament. There's one God. That's what we all believe. And if this was the equivalent of what has happened with this Romans 9 debate, you know, what the Unitarians would be in the comments saying is, well, and what Dr. White has argued. Now, Dr. White, in the same discussion, I said, well, AK didn't present much. I mean, he's supposed to present his theology, and he didn't give me much, you know. And Jeremiah Nortier is saying, yeah, but you know you're bringing presuppositions of libertarian free will. And I keep saying, no, I didn't argue for those. Yeah, but you have them. So that would be equivalent of the Unitarians saying, you know, you haven't made a case for the Trinity, though. You know, I've given you my exegesis. Where is AK's defense of the Trinity in this verse? And I would say, I don't believe it is I don't believe this verse is establishing the Trinity, not my position. Well, you know you bring Trinitarian presuppositions. Well, I do have presuppositions when I'm here at this text. Of course, I believe from other passages in the New Testament, but I'm not bringing those into the verse because I'm not making the case that it is establishing the Trinity. So this would be an example where you're debating a passage, and again, I wouldn't debate one verse. That would be too limited. But just hypothetically here, just as a thought exercise here, this is a case where my opponent in the debate is using it as a proof text for their theology that I disagree with. And what I'm doing is I'm showing, no, a proper exegesis does not establish their case. But I'm not trying to show that it establishes the opposite or opposing viewpoint of the Trinity. See, because I don't believe that it does. I believe that's established in other cases, in other scriptures. Meanwhile, my Unitarian opponent who denies the Trinity would be in discussions afterwards saying, you know, well, AK didn't have a theology. He didn't present one. He's supposed to. He didn't give me anything to work with. I know I presented my Unitarian case. He did not present his Trinitarian case. And then the Unitarians were saying, AK, you just think this is a debate on Unitarianism. But what about the Trinity? You're supposed to argue for your case. And I'm sitting here trying to figure out how to get it clear to you guys. You see, I'm not saying, and my methodology, my position is not that this proves my case, but that properly exegeted does not establish what you say that it does. You see the difference? Now, there will be now, how about something different? Let's say, for example, let me think. If we have a passage that I believe, if we had some other passage, okay, let's do this. How about this? Okay. How about John 1? Now, let's suppose, and they do, I think, but let's suppose I'm talking with a Jehovah's Witness or somebody who's also a Unitarian, and we're debating John 1. Now, obviously, I believe John chapter 1 does establish at least that Jesus is divine. You got two persons. You know, it doesn't talk so much about the Spirit here. But it does establish more my position, right? So, but let's say that the Unitarian, maybe it was a Jehovah's Witness, now they don't debate. I mean, I know Greg Stafford did. But let's say I'm debating a Unitarian who also does believe, and he attempts to use John 1 to establish Unitarianism, however he might try to do that. So not only does he not believe, my opponent, that John 1 establishes anything with the Trinity or with Jesus being God and distinct from the Father, but he also believes that it establishes Unitarianism. Now you got a passage where both parties use the passage as a proof text. That's what they're trying to do for their opposing viewpoints. So this would not be just him showing that my viewpoint is false, but he's also got to demonstrate his viewpoint, that it establishes his side. Now you see the difference in the two approaches here. Because in one case, the passage being debated by two people, like Deuteronomy 6 in our hypothetical, is used as a proof text by one person in the debate, but not the other. And so the other person is just trying to show properly exegeted, properly interpreted, properly understood. It doesn't establish anything with, it doesn't establish Unitarianism. And what it is the Unitarian is bringing stuff into the text that isn't there. He's bringing presuppositions to it that in which he is trying to establish his case. Now, that would be different in this other hypothetical I presented where we're going to John 1, and both the Unitarian and the Trinitarian say this passage establishes my case. Now you've got two viewpoints. Now you see how this is, both have to be approached differently because of the passage you're debating. Now, so it is when you come to Romans chapter 9. I do not believe that what Paul is dealing with is libertarian free will. He's not trying to establish that God unconditionally chooses who will believe. And so what I did is I'm not, because people kept saying, Calvinists kept saying, hey, Kay, you're just trying to debate Calvinism. I'm trying to show that the Calvinistic conclusions from their exegesis with James White is based upon bringing things into the text that is not there. And that if you do not bring things into the text, and if you only read it for what it says, you are not going to get Calvinism. That was my point. And so when they're saying, when James White was saying later, well, AK, I mean, he didn't interpret the text. Well, where's his beliefs? I mean, he didn't give me anything. You know, where's the libertarian free will case and all this? You're missing the point. Dr. White missed the point. I am not using Romans 9 as a proof text for my theology that opposes his. I'm demonstrating that the text itself cannot establish his. I'm not claiming that it establishes mine. What my case is that properly exegeted, there's nothing in the passage, especially the first 24 verses, that establishes his conclusions. And that if you leave all the things out that he brings into it, that he eisegetes into the text, the anachronisms that James White brings to it, the presuppositions in which he uses to argue his interpretation, Romans 9. If you leave without those things, he cannot get his theology. And so for all you Calvinists out there, you have to know how this works. And so the other aspect now is, well, no, Romans 8 is very irrelevant. Well, no, it's relevant, of course. I never argue that it's not relevant. The issue is, and this would be the case with any topic, where you're debating a passage related to any topic is what I mean. Okay. If you come to a text in which you believe other passages in the surrounding context, because of what they say, it is necessary to interpret this particular passage in a certain way, but your opponent disagrees with how you interpret the other passages. You cannot fall back on Romans 8 unless it becomes a Romans 8 debate. And that's all that Dr. White wants to talk about. He's using a system. He's bringing a systematized theology to Romans 9. And by the way, I'm not opposed to systematizing theology. In other words, what we're all trying to do is read all of Scripture understand each thing correctly and try to put these together in a harmonious way, because truth is harmonious. We believe that there is a unification of all the truth of Scripture because it's all true. And so we're seeking to put everything together, right? The analogy of Scripture. We're trying to put all the truths that we get from Scripture together for one whole truth. So I'm not opposed to systematizing things, if by that we simply mean we're trying to harmonize everything with itself, all of Scripture together. But here's the thing. When everybody claims that a proof text establishes your case, or a particular passage, and the other person says that doesn't establish your case, and then you say, let's debate the passage, you cannot then spend time on other scriptures, even if it's the one before or after. That's not how an exegetical debate, because I don't grant to the Calvinist their interpretation of the Romans 8:28 or Romans 8:5, and those passages that in Romans 8 where it talks about the carnal mind, what they can or cannot do versus the spiritual mind. I have a different view than you do. And so they keep relying, James relies on a Calvinistic understanding of Romans 8 to argue a case from Romans 9. Well, I don't grant to you those Calvinistic understandings of Romans 8. Well, then we got to debate Romans 8. We can't debate two passages at once. I mean, unless, first of all, you agree to that, and number two, you get a much longer debate. It's not how it works. And Dr. White has to understand it's not how it works. Even in the discussion with Jeremiah Nortier, he spends most of his time on Romans 8. Well, then have a Romans 8 debate. Now, did I gather some information from the context before Romans 9 in my opening? You bet I did. But I was careful not to do it in such a way that I used my understanding of things Paul said before Romans 9, in which I knew Dr. White would disagree with. Why? Because if I use those things, if those things are necessary to my conclusions in Romans 9, that's called begging the question. Because Dr. White would say, well, how you're interpreting those teachings of Paul in the first 8 chapters is wrong. So I don't grant you those things. So then this is why you got Romans 9 wrong. I was careful not to do that because I am very careful with how these things work. And by the way, I'm always trying to be very careful of that. I can look at some of my earlier debates and I can say, you know what? No, that's not how that works. Now, do I believe I had the truth in my earlier debates? Well, sure. But as far as my approach, I remember one debate in which I was doing a rebuttal in my opening. I had the second opening. And I've since, I could easily look back and say, well, no, that's not really how that's supposed to work. I mean, but of course, Matt Slick was doing the same thing. And so I kind of just let it happen and I did the same thing. But really, that's not how it works. And so, because I believe in proper methodology, which Dr. White did not follow. And I'm ready to demonstrate that and have. In fact, we've beat a dead horse. I say it's dead, but really the horse is still twitching and jerking. There's still some spasms going on in this corpse of this horse. And so we keep thrusting blows upon him with our theological sticks. But my point is, Dr. White is the one who did not follow proper procedure. He still has not grasped that, and a lot of the Calvinists have not. So with David Lewis, I get it though. Here's the thing about here. Listen to this. Listen to this. I'm at the same time I'm realizing, it's people don't get this, and I'm not trying to insult anybody. I'm just saying in general, it seems like people just are not picking up on this. Because the same thing happened when I did a debate with David Lewis we did 3 passages, and man, it's hard enough to do one passage and get everything you need. My debate with David Lewis, you can find it on my channel, and you can find it on his too. We did 3 passages each. Now, there were 3 passages related to a topic, losing salvation. And everybody knows, my views on that, and I'm not trying to get into those issues here. But when I did that, I did the same thing when it came to Romans 8. And by the way, I think it seems to me I'm in the minority on that, my viewpoints. I think with Calvinism, I'm not. So, anyway, don't get sidetracked here. No, I do try to see things that might catch my eye in the side chat, but I get a lot, I get people saying quite often, I have for a long time, stop responding to the side chat so much because your material is good, but boy, you get off. There is truth to that. I mean, it really stops the flow of discussion, but I try to catch something important there, but I do appreciate all you guys. Anyway, so even now, see, I somewhat lost my train of thought there. That's the way it is. Now, what was I saying? Oh, in the Romans 8 debate. Well, when it came to Romans 8, well, it wasn't, you think, are you talking about Romans 9 debate? No, I'm actually talking about the Romans 8 debate I did with David Lewis, but it was actually on 3. There were 6 passages total. Now, when it came to the topic of losing salvation, he had 3 passages for himself. I had 3 passages. I picked 3 passages I believed could establish my belief. He picked 3 that established his. And when we debated them, like with Romans 8, I believe, same idea. I believe properly exegeted, Romans 8 does not establish his case, but it doesn't establish mine. I do not believe Romans 8 proves you can lose salvation as a saved person, but he thought it did. And people kept saying kept saying it, and I could not get it through to them. But, but AK, I mean, you didn't prove your case for Romans 8, and I kept saying, that's not my passage. I didn't pick Romans 8. I don't claim that Romans 8 is is a proof text for my view. And I tried explaining the same things I do now with Romans 9. That was his passage. Oh, and by the way, and I'm not saying David Lewis didn't get it. I'm saying I got lots of responses from other people. But maybe even more recent, when I debated Corey Minor from the Smart Christians channel on John 10, when we discussed, it wasn't a formal debate, it was a discussion on Marlon Wilson's channel. And we talked about John 10 for like the first half of our discussion. And by the way, there's a point where I can push. And the reason I pushed harder in that, and I hammered, is because I know how Corey Minor is. He wants to do most of the talking. He wants to take the time to lecture and give a sermon. And that's kind of how he gets his point in his discussions. He dominates the debate that way, and I wasn't going to let that happen. But never mind. My point is, we talked about John 10, and he argued how this proves his case, and I kept saying, no, it doesn't, no, it doesn't. I gave my reasons. I showed how he was making logical implications that were false, and he was relying on these faulty implications of logic. And what was the number one complaint I got? The number one complaint I got was, AK, you did not prove that you could lose salvation from John 10. He said, AK, you didn't make your case. And even though I kept saying the same things that I'm saying now, so evidently these things are hard for people to understand, but I kept saying, I did not try to establish my case with John 10. I don't claim that it's a proof passage. That was his passage. I believe properly exegeted, it does not establish his case, but it doesn't establish mine necessarily. No, and then in the second half of our discussion, me and Corey, I went to Galatians 5, in which I thought this does establish my case. And it's interesting because I did get a comment, I remember, and there were several like this. But I got one comment from a Calvinist who said, now listen, AK, I'm sorry, but you failed to prove your case from John 10, but you did much better in John 5. And I thought, if you just think about it for a moment, you make my point. The reason he thinks I did a much better job in John 5 is because it seemed like I was making a better case for my position in Galatians 5, was because I was using Galatians 5 as a case for my belief. That was exactly the point, and I wasn't for John 10. You see, this is how that works. So it really is important to grasp these things, because this is how debates are supposed to work. And if anybody should know, it's Dr. White. And I'm sorry, but Dr. White has, I think, really dropped the ball in the things he's saying. I mean, he's misrepresented it so much. And I'm thankful and appreciative of so many comments, even from Calvinists, saying, I believe that you were trying to be fair and represent things fair. That is because I am not trying to debate straw men. I do not want to debate straw men. I've spent countless hours over the years, countless years, listening to Calvinists in their own words. I've got books by them. All right. Okay, so I'm going to try to refresh this. All right, so I think I'm back on. Yes, I know the video looks bad. Yes, hold on, give me a second. What I did was I put my book down and I hit a button. And that was not good. So let me try to do this here. Give me a second. I'm going to take the camera off. Might not work here. Yep, there we go. All right, sorry about that. Well, that wasn't good because we were doing well. Yes, so I held up the book. When I put it down, it hit and turned off my, what do you call that thing? You have everything plugged into it, and I turned it off. So that wasn't good. But hopefully we're still alive, still going. Everything looks good now, right? So I did book dial. That's what I did. Okay, so I don't even know what point I was making. Well, it had something to do with the book. Oh, well, I don't want to debate that was sabotage. Dr. White sabotaged the program through his book. So I got to make sure I don't do that again. Anyway, my whole point was I want to debate straw men. I don't want to debate. I want to debate steel men, not straw men. Calvinists are going to say that was a Freudian slip. Okay, but let's go back to the video and let's listen some more.
But his rebuttals, his questions, and his closing already written out. So it's like, all right.
Now, he's not talking about me here.
Going to be getting into the text too much here. And as everybody knows, what Leighton Flowers wants to debate is free will, total depravity, incapacity, such. That's all. I said on the dividing line, there's this text, and I didn't look it up, but in 2 Chronicles somewhere it says, 2 at the par bar, 4 at the causeway, and 2 at the par bar. Okay? And at least I've got the verse memorized. And if we debated that text, he'd make it about total depravity, human ability, whatever. He could do that. Very skilled in only talking about one thing. So, at least if someone wants to dive into it, and I did do an unbelievable radio broadcast about. There were some people who were saying that they had really come up with a new understanding that, and it really didn't make much sense. But so I at least I.
No, I don't remember him mentioning you. I'm not sure what you referring to.
And this also explains why I didn't get into some of the things I could have. If I had wanted to push some buttons, if I had wanted to push the Church of Christ stuff, the baptism stuff, the justification by faith, the faith rather than by faith stuff.
I don't know what his deal here is. Actually, I think that I do, rhetorically, that's what I meant. So this whole idea of I could have pushed this stuff, yeah, and you did try that. It was off topic, and I brought us back. But the fact that he keeps saying I could have went here, yeah, well, it's off topic. So why would you have? I mean, anybody can say I could have got off topic. So this is all meaningless. Can anybody say I could have went off topic? I could have pushed this. I could have pushed that. You know, I debated. You know, like when we were debating. Actually, I did some of those exegetical debates with somebody else. Who was it? I think what's that guy's name he was another Baptist. Oh, I don't even remember his name. It was on the Donnie's channel. Oh, I don't know. I saw that comment. I could have been a contender, and I don't even know what that's about, but if it's connected to what White was saying, somehow that cracked me up. Tommy, yes, Tommy something. And so we were debating passages, unless I'm confusing, this was something else. And you know, any topic, even if it's a topic. Listen, I debated Jeremiah Nortier on free will, and listen, I could have debated. I could have gone off into eschatology, I suppose. Well, we share the same eschatology, but I could have went off into other things. I could have went off into that. So basically, all White is saying here is I could have went off topic. Well, besides the fact that I tried to, so what? I mean, anybody can go off topic. That's why you pick your topics.
I could have, but that would have the end of the debate on Romans 9.
Sure. Anytime you go off topic, it's the end of the debate on that topic. That's kind of a given, right? Tommy McMurtry, yeah.
And unfortunately, for most of the people watching, what had been said in Romans 9 up to that point would have been lost, as the debate would have gone into other topics.
Which is exactly why I kept saying it's off topic. Now, I realize that beyond our disagreements in Romans 9, the whole of our theology is going to be relevant. Everything connects to something, you know. Your beliefs on other things and how they connect, or how they are consistent, or if they are consistent with other beliefs, yeah, it's all ultimately relevant. And, you know, some people were saying that, well, your overall theology on these other topics matters. Yes, but you're not debating, but you can't bring everything into every debate has limitations in its scope. You could say, well, everything else is relevant, and then not stay on the debate, and then ultimately you get nowhere. That's one of the reasons you have a debate on a particular thing, and very much so on a passage. You see, one thing, you say, well, you know, Romans, or a debate on a particular passage is so limiting. Well, that's one of the reasons you're doing it, because when you do a topic, because you were so free to go on such a variety of scriptures related to it or issues related to it, you never spend too much time on one thing, and so you cover a lot without getting too deep. That's one of the drawbacks. And where you gain something in a passage debate is you have to focus deeper and more thoroughly on one thing. So that's part of it. That's the whole point of doing a Romans, or rather a passage debate. That's one of the reasons you're doing an exegetical debate. That's the very purpose of an exegetical debate, is to have that limitation so that you can at least, you know, get to the bottom or close to it on something. Well, yeah, but then you have so much left over from these other things. That's right. It's kind of at least you've taken care of one thing. The whole purpose of it.
Since it's starting much later in the debate, it's going to be very surface level. You're not going to be able to get into any depth on it.
Now, see, this is what I'm talking about. I'm sorry, Reformed Redneck. Now, maybe you're not. I think that you're talking to me, right? Okay, we're confusing two different things. Now, first of all, somebody says, and I am going to mention the comments because this is very much what I'm talking about. He says, with the standard you are using by default, you went off topic too by the multiple references to Calvinism. That's not off topic, because the topic is Romans chapter 9. And I said, if you bring in certain ideas from their exegesis, you are eisegeting Romans 9. Well, it's not off topic, the topic is Romans 9. If I'm debating a Unitarian on the Shema of Deuteronomy 6, and he's relying on presuppositions or the assumption that there cannot be multiple persons in God, even with one God, and I say, no, you're bringing you are assuming Unitarianism to the passage to exegete it in your way. And you say, well, you're going off topic because you're debating Unitarianism. You keep referencing Unitarianism. No, that's not off topic. When I am rebutting the exegesis of Deuteronomy 6:4, you see, my references to Calvinism is because I am rebutting the other person's exegesis on Romans 9. Now, I do say that some of it was preemptive rebuttal in my opening, but I was very clear about that. I was very clear, and even Dr. White said beforehand there's going to be some preemptive rebuttals. That's kind of the way it is. He does it, I do it. Because I do believe one of the ways in which you try to be clear about what a passage is saying is by being clear about what it isn't saying. And so when I said, I don't see anything in the passage yet about God unconditionally choosing who will believe and be saved, I'm saying that would be eisegesis, right? I don't see anything is an argument that you can't exegete the text properly and get that. That's not off topic, so you are wrong about that. But somebody else did say Romans 8 isn't off topic because it can bear significance in Romans 8. Okay. It is off topic to debate Romans 8. You understand what I'm saying? I did not say it's not relevant. In fact, I believe all of Romans 1 through 8 is relevant because it sets the stage for what came for Romans 9. You're still not getting me. Some things are off topic because they're a different discussion, a different topic, like a once saved, always saved, baptism. Some things are off topic because they require the focus and have a different debate. Now, I can draw from Romans 8. I said in my opening, you got Romans 8 in which you have Paul's exposition on salvation for those who are in Christ. Yes, I went to Romans 8. And I talked about the central theme of justification by faith throughout all of 8 chapters. I said that in my opening. So I'm not just claiming that those chapters are off topic. I'm saying that if we are debating the passages, if we disagree on an interpretation in those passages, and therefore we have to debate it, then we are off topic because we're debating a different passage. That's why when I did reference anything from Romans 1 through 8, I was sure and careful to only establish or bring up things in which I knew Dr. White would agree with. You have to do that because then it's called begging the question. If I'm relying on something from 1 through 8 that he would disagree with, and then I use that in Romans 8, that's called begging the question. That's the point. That's what you have to understand. Now, Reformed Redneck says, the reference to Romans 8 was clarifying that Romans 9 is referring to individuals, not the nation. But we didn't disagree on that, right? I mean, I said there's individuals. See, I think that is a distraction when people debate that. Is Romans 9 about nations or is it about individuals? Well, you've got references to both. Pharaoh was an individual. Jacob and Esau are individuals. But even Jacob and Esau is communicating something about nations. But you also got individuals. It's not about nations versus individuals so much as it is whether God is unconditionally choosing whether there are individuals or even nations, I suppose, if that could work, who will believe and be saved, and whether God is making the choice. So it's not individuals versus nations. It's about, is God unconditionally choosing which individuals will believe and be saved? So it wasn't relevant so much because I didn't deny individuals versus... Now, so by the way, that's important too. Everybody keep it in mind. When I did my opening and I exegeted Romans 9, I was clear to say we see individuals here, nations are being talked about, and it's a soteriological issue. So.
on anything you do talk about. So I didn't go there because I felt that in the discussion of Romans 9, the back and forth initially, up to the cross-ex and through the beginning of the cross-ex, I thought something very important had already been established. And that was the connection between the golden chain and Romans 9, specifically 20 through 24.
No, Twitchy, that would not be my point.
Even we whom he called, it's the same term, called. And if you recall, he struggled to try to explain the relationship. I mean, his whole argument, and I think I'm being.
I was looking at my cup. I don't know what color. I thought maybe it was green because I'm colorblind. If that was the case, when green things show up, is this green? Evidently not. I'm colorblind, so some things I have green things and I can't.
Fair here. His whole approach is to reduce Romans 9 as much as possible. Read out of it anything that could possibly be considered to be reformed. So his statement over and over again, there's nothing uniquely Calvinistic here. There's nothing that establishes Calvinism. It's a mantra that repeats over and over again. But once you recognize the context, once you recognize that Romans 8 is what...
Let's think about this. Now, first of all, you said I struggled. When he was asking me about calling, I was answering his questions, but wasn't quite always sure what he was asking. Now, but that's not what he means by struggling. He thinks I'm struggling because my positions on these, my theology can't work well with them, of course. If any struggle I had, I remember him asking me, and I wasn't sure what he was asking. I was just trying to answer it as he was asking. Now, one of the questions he asked was, so is the calling the same? Was the vessels of dishonor, were they called in the same way? And I was thinking, what does that mean? Were they called in the same way? In the passage, there's no references to them to being called. And Paul's not talking about that. And of course, I know that Calvinists have two types of callings, and so I'm trying to figure out what he's asking me so I could properly answer it. That was the only struggle. Now, ultimately, he doesn't get anywhere like he thinks he does. I believe this is soteriology in Romans 9 about the vessels of honor. I believe the calling there, when it talks about we who are called in verse 24, this is salvation. I mean, so I'm not inconsistent. I know the calling in Romans 8 is soteriological, and I know that it is in Romans 9, at least where it is soteriological in the passage about the vessels of honor, vessels of dishonor. I have no problem with that. I said the vessels of honor is about salvation. And Paul is not addressing whether they were called the vessels of dishonor, that is, or not. Was it the same? And so I was trying to figure out what question he was asking me so that I could properly answer it.
This question about the Jews, and then Paul goes back to using the same language when he's explaining vessels of wrath prepared for destruction, vessels of mercy prepared for glory, even those whom he called from amongst Jews and Greeks. And it's the exact same terminology. It's the exact same language.
Of course. I mean, yes, I believe the vessels of honor has to do with salvation, of course.
And I think he really stumbled very badly when he tried to break the golden chain up and say...
But, Dr. White, don't you see, trying to break the golden chain up? Really... Again, Dr. White, it is evident to anybody who will see that Dr. White felt like he had a better case in Romans 8 than he did in Romans 9. which is exactly what I wanted to happen, by the way. Not a debate on Romans 8. I wanted it to be demonstrated because I believe it is true, and I think I succeeded, that Romans 9 is not a proof text. That one, for Calvinism. And that the only reason they think it is because they bring ideas into the text that it doesn't say, and because they presuppose other parts of Calvinism when they read it. And everybody brings presuppositions, but when the presupposition, if you're relying on a particular presupposition to prove your case in Romans 9, well, I mean, and I deny it, I don't even agree with that presupposition, then it's called proof text. And so, no, Romans 9 can't be a proof text. Maybe Romans 8 can. And so, if he thought that Romans 9 itself was so clear on establishing unconditional election of Calvinism, he didn't need to spend so much time. It's obvious that he wanted to debate Romans 8. And the Calvinists keep saying it's very relevant. Even if it's relevant, do you not think Romans 9 establishes your case? In other words, let's say for the sake of discussion that Romans 8 establishes Calvinism. Okay. Now, I don't believe that it does, but let's say that it does. Does Romans 9? Now, if you're honest and you say, okay, well, if you say that it does, that Romans 9 also establishes Calvinism, then I'll say, show it, prove it. And then if you have to start jumping to Romans 8, I say, no. I mean, I get Romans 8. If you want to say, well, Romans establishes Calvinism because of Romans 8, Romans 9 can be Calvinistic because of Romans 8, I'll say, okay, so it all comes down to Romans 8. So it's not that Romans 9 is a proof text, it's that Romans 8 is. And so what I'm doing with these exegetical debates is eliminating proof text to show, no, you lost that one. Okay, so Romans 9 ain't a proof text. Mark that off as a proof text. Maybe Romans 8 is. Okay, so next time let's debate Romans chapter 8. And now what I believe I can do is demonstrate that isn't one either. But it's very obvious that he felt much more confident in Romans 8 with me than he did in Romans 9. Now, so for example, I don't think, as far as I remember, Matt Slick had no problem staying in Romans 9. Now, that's been a while, so maybe Matt Slick was doing the same thing. I don't even quite remember at this point. But I remember actually doing more with Romans 9 with Matt Slick than I did James White. My memory could be failing me. All right, so here's what I want to do. I got another one. So let's go to this one. We're not going to get into the question and answer of the, because I do got to do something here coming up. But listen.
Now, you said something that rivaled your Ignatius quote from a few previous debates. So I've had Dr. White, I've had to tell people, hey, go talk to Dr. White. He qualified that Adam pre-fall was still a creature.
Yeah, so you can't. So you cannot make any statement publicly on the internet any longer where the rest of the context is provided within 15 seconds. Nobody cares. Nobody cares. Did he have libertarian free will? Well, yeah. I mean, he was unfallen. He's a creature. So it's not outside the decree of God, obviously.
And so basically what they're saying is he caused a lot of controversy over the statement and the concession. And I think it was a huge victory. Because let me tell you something. Number one, and again, of course, if you didn't catch it, it was the part of the cross-examination where I got him to say that God is still sovereign even if man has libertarian free will. The reason it's so significant, and I knew it was as soon as he said it, and when he said it, I thought, wow, did he say that? That's a huge concession. What do I do with this? And so when he said Adam had libertarian free will, that's when I said, all right, here's my question. I thought about it for a second. I thought, this is huge. And then I immediately knew my next question. So you're saying God is still sovereign, even if man has libertarian free will? Because let me tell you something. Two things. The reason this is huge is because so much of what Calvinists argue and believe is that libertarian free will would mean God is not sovereign. In fact, it would mean to them, man is sovereign, that it is incompatible, that God cannot be sovereign if man has libertarian free will. In fact, it's the opposite. God is the slave. God is the one who has to do things, and man gets to do what he wants. I have been talking with Calvinists for many years now. I've had discussions with them. I've had debates with them. I've read their material. So much of what they say is to say that, well, if you believe in libertarian free will, you cannot believe God is sovereign. They can't reconcile that. And so I knew that this was huge. The second thing is, so many Calvinists now are saying, no, Dr. White, he lost it there. He shouldn't have said that. Even their own admissions now.
But if all you're talking,
and even Jeremiah was saying, you made a big stink with this, and they get it. That was a big part of it, him saying that.
About here is the impact of the fall upon the will of man. Then obviously Adam was not fallen, and we can't say anything more about Adam because we're only given 2 chapters before the fall takes place.
Now I'm curious. I don't know if this is supposed to be Greek. Thesarene, or is it just an English word? What's your name? Thysarevan? It's got to be Greek, right? So you said White fumbled. I'm just curious because I haven't caught on. Are you a Calvinist or are you a non-Calvinist?
And we're not given anything more about that. And there is a difference. I believe that Augustine was right, and
okay. So I appreciate your objectivity. So he is Thesarene is a Calvinist, and he's saying White fumbled there, and he's a Calvinist. So we got someone who's, I'm going to take you to be objective. You said, yeah, well, he did fumble, and so I appreciate the fairness and I appreciate the honesty. But what he's saying is, no, it's not possible. He's a Calvinist. He says, no, you can't have libertarian free will and God be sovereign. So he's an example of what I'm talking about. And White is basically saying here, I know people are taking me out of context. No, he said what he said.
Redeemed saint has a...
And so this is White's book, and I just want to read a couple things. And I could pick more here, but to save time, I'm just going to pick a couple. So, for example, let's see here. He's talking about unconditional election. He talks about it in pages 177, or page 177, Dr. White's book, The Potter's Freedom. And he's talking about the passage in Ephesians 1. Let me back up a bit here. Okay, he says, it should be noted that at this point, all the verbs in the passage have had God as their subject. Men have not added an iota to the discussion outside of being adopted into the family of God. That is, saved in that perfectly. God is the one who is free in eternity past. He is not controlled by the whims and will of creatures he has yet to bring into existence. Now notice the language. Now what is he opposing? That man is free. Well, because and this book is a response to Geisler, what's his name? Norman Geisler, I think, who wrote a book, and evident from everything I read from White's representation and quotes from it, I haven't read that book, then I would have a hard time reading that book too, because it doesn't make sense to me. But the book was called Free But Chosen, and so the idea that you can be free, well, they believe we're compatibilistically free, but obviously Dr. White is opposing what kind of freedom, therefore? Libertarian free will. And he knows that a non-Calvinist understanding of Ephesians would be a position in which you believe man is libertarian and free. And he knows our position, right? That we choose to believe, but God has predestined things about the believer. And so when he says, God is the one who is free in eternity past, he is not controlled by the whims and will of his creatures. This is why Dr. White is being inconsistent. Because White has argued the case that if man has libertarian free will, this means God is being controlled. I've heard him responding to this idea, I've heard him say it in his discussions, where one says God is free to choose to make his creatures free in a libertarian sense. And he would say, and one of his responses was, so the first thing God did in his sovereignty was choose not to be sovereign. Which shows that he doesn't believe it's possible for God to be sovereign. So, because if he gives man libertarian free will, he's not sovereign all of a sudden, which is more consistent. See, Thessaloniki is being more consistent there. And White is being inconsistent because there he is showing that he doesn't believe God is sovereign if man is free. Just like here, he is not controlled, which means he would be controlled if man has libertarian free will. So he's being controlled means he's not sovereign, right? Which is obviously his point here. And by the way, that's exactly the flaw in his reasoning. And I believe it would be the flaw in, I'm just going to call you Thess. I believe it's the flaw in his reasoning too. You see, you can. If God, see, I think for a Calvinist, I appreciate the objectivity of Thessi here. I call you Thessi. But I still believe you're wrong. You see, because God is very free, but he's not so free that he can create free creatures. God is very, very free. And they say that we are the ones, as non-Calvinists, are limiting God's freedom, but they're the ones saying, well, he's not so free that he can create a libertarianly free creature. Well, sure he can. He just got to create a creature who can choose, and God choosing not to determine his choices. That's not so hard. So I believe he's more free than evidently Thessi does. But, or somebody like him. I'm not just trying to single you out. I mean, you were very objective, and you were able to say White fumbled the ball. So I hope you don't mind me kind of using you there for both points. But I do appreciate you coming. So that's what White is saying. He is not controlled by the whims and will of creatures. So it's inconsistent. He doesn't believe God is sovereign if man has libertarian free will. Let me see what else I got here. Oh, let's see. I hope it's something good. Okay. How about this? Talking about Romans 9. This is a section on Romans 9. This is from page 225 in Dr. White's book. Talking about verse 16. He says here, just as he's responding to a quote from Norman Geisler in his book, he says, White says, just as we had to express our amazement at the insertion of acts of free will, of course, it would have to be libertarian free will, right? Because Dr. White doesn't oppose compatibilistic free will, which, by the way, I don't even believe really are free. I don't believe that means anything in compatibilism, but nevertheless. So we know he's opposing libertarian free will here. So we expressed our amazement as the insertion of acts of free will into Romans 9:16 from earlier parts. So too, here we cannot help but point out that the main point of the entire passage, Romans 9, is overthrown and literally contradicted, all to maintain the supremacy of the free choices of men. Because you see, non-Calvinists believe that men have free will. And Romans 9 doesn't contradict that. That God is sovereign in Romans 9. This was my point in my opening. God is sovereign, but man is still free to choose. It does not disprove that God is God's sovereignty does not disprove libertarian free will. But notice how he words it. And that he calls it the supremacy of the free will of men. Well, you can go to page 225 and see the context. I'm sure people will say that. But unless you believe that he thinks Norman Geisler is arguing for compatibilistic free will, and that can't be what White is opposing, because White believes in compatibilistic free will, so it has to be libertarian free will, in which case he's saying, well, this is an attempt to maintain the supremacy of the free choices of men. The supremacy. Well, I thought Dr. White, believed God is still sovereign even if man has libertarian free will. Notice, the parable, this is of the vessels of honor and dishonor. he says, same page, God is not limited by the free choices of people. Well, let me back up. The parable shows God's complete, notice the language. The parable shows God's complete sovereignty over the nation of Israel. But Dr. White he believes this demonstrates that man isn't free in the libertarian sense. That's his whole point. But the parable shows God's complete sovereignty over the nation of Israel. He can do with the nation as he wishes. He is not limited by the free choices of people. Did he have complete sovereignty over Adam, who Dr. White believes had free will? Did God have complete sovereignty? If man has libertarian free will, and Dr. White does believe Adam did, so then evidently God wasn't limited by the free choices of Adam in that case. Well, there you go. You see how it is inconsistent. Dr. White is being inconsistent. So God can do with the nation as he wishes. He is not limited by the free choices of people. But Dr. White here is arguing against believing that man is free, libertarianly so, even in a reading of Romans 9. Surely he calls the nation to repent, beginning of verse 7, but upon what principle of logic? Now this is a reference to what Dr. Geisler was saying in Jeremiah 18. And he's making a case for Romans 9 and the vessels of honor. So the verse 7 and 18. But upon what principle of logic or hermeneutics are we to believe that the actual point of the parable is that the clay can force? Now, you know Dr. Geisler, of course, had to be arguing for, as I said, libertarian free will in Jeremiah, not compatibilistic. So, therefore, the representation of libertarian free will as used with vessels of clay in Jeremiah 18 to Dr. White is that this would be the clay forcing, meaning God is not sovereign, but rather man is, the clay forcing the potter's hand. You see, he does believe that if we believe people are libertarianly free, this is somehow forcing God to do things. That this is meaning that God is limited by man's free choices. So no, he does not consistently believe you can be sovereign and man still have libertarian free will. I'm sorry, Dr. White, but you are being inconsistent. That's why that admission was so huge. That's why you gave up so much in that debate, and this is why you're having so much pushback.
Greater position in heaven than Adam had, because of the completion of the work of the Spirit of God in the sanctifying work of the individual, union with Christ, new creation. So you can get into all the hadn't sinned but possibly could sin, and all the possibility stuff that has been discussed down through the ages. But I was just simply saying, well, yeah, Adam's unfallen, but there aren't any Adams. And I guess from his perspective, yeah, there are Adams. Every child is born
exactly.
is a new Adam.
Yep.
Well, yeah, and so, but again, that was a different topic, right? Is it related? Well, sure. But my presuppositions, it's a presupposition if we're looking at Romans 9, I believe I could establish my case in other passages. I wouldn't establish it from Romans 9. But if I'm reading Romans 9, and I do have the presuppositions of that we do not have the T of the tulip, that we are not totally depraved from birth, but I did not use that to argue for anything in Romans 9. I could grant to you that we don't have libertarian free will, and everything I said in my exegesis of Romans 9, for the most part, is going to remain the same. For the most part. So, anyway.
We are not.
Yeah, I have an ad there. Well, I'm going to close it there because I'm about to bring this whole thing to a close. But I'm sorry, but Dr. White is having pushback over that concession. And I'm so glad we had the debate. So, yes, I think it is inconsistent of Dr. White with everything he's ever said. There's probably more in here on the same thing. He talks about God being sovereign over the whole universe. So, no, Dr. White's whole position is that sovereignty means he determines everything. In fact, one of the definitions he has given before is that if you do not believe in unconditional election, you do not believe in the sovereignty of God. I quoted that in my debate with Jeremiah because we were talking about free will. That's something Dr. White has said. If you do not believe in unconditional election, then you do not believe in the sovereignty of God. You see how he, and I don't remember exactly which dividing line program that came from, but I know already where that's cited. If you want to look, you can go to my debate with Jeremiah Nordier in my opening, and I cited and quoted Dr. White saying that. And so he has said that. If you do not believe in unconditional election, then you don't believe in the sovereignty of God. So then, yes, God unconditionally choosing people is God's sovereignty. Well, you can't have libertarian free will. And see, if you believe in libertarian free will, then you could not have unconditional election. In which case, according to Dr. White, you cannot have the sovereignty of God. Very inconsistent. And Dr. White was more comfortable in Romans 8. That's where he wanted to spend most of his time. He wanted to spend it on other topics as well. Even in post-debate discussions, he wanted to do that. I think why that is has become very evident. So, anyway, yeah, I think Dr. White has fumbled the ball several times in that debate. Now, I can only imagine, because he keeps saying he could have pushed harder. I can only imagine if I would have pushed harder too, and I was trying to be respectful, and I didn't want him to shut it down. When Steve Gregg tried to push him, and I think in a non-disrespectful way, it's part of a debate. You can push on people. But I was afraid he was going to do this thing where he says, all right, well, let's just do something different. But I appreciate you guys. I appreciate you, Reformed Redneck, as well, for the discussion. And, anyway, remember the podcast. I try to do it on Mondays and Tuesdays. I'm not always successful, as I said, because of work, but share the word about it. Also, you could look me up on Twitter. I don't do Twitter as much as I do, the YouTube. But tell people about the podcast. It's available in audio on podcast. I've only got 2 episodes so far, because not everything I do on YouTube, like this right here, it's not always going to be on my podcast. But let everybody know about it. And so, bring more attention to these things. I appreciate the discussions. I appreciate the feedback. God bless you on this Saturday.